Today we're going to talk about IPv6 address planning as a survival guide. And so the reason I've sort of called it this is that from my own experience in doing this, there's just a small handful of ideas that if you establish them in your mind early on, it will prevent a lot of pain and suffering down the road. I guess is true of so many things in networking and life in general. But the idea here is that I'm going to give you a handful of principles to go from that will hopefully prevent you from having to redo your address plan down the road. In the spirit of full disclosure, I had to redo mine several times. A little bit about my background in that context. So I came from Infoblox. I just recently started an IT consultancy focused around advancing cloud, IoT, and security through IPv6, and that company's called HexaBuild. But before that, I was with Infoblox, where I was an IPv6 evangelist and very much interested in getting enterprises, who of course are Infoblox's primary customers, to adopt IPv6. I don't know how much success I had in doing that. Based on the data that we've looked at recently, not that much. Before that, I was at Limelight Networks, the content delivery network, where I deployed IPv6, and that's where I messed up my first several IPv6 address plans. That if I'd had the principles that I'm going to share today, I probably would have not had to redo the address plan so many times initially. And I got so spun up about address planning in general that I wrote a book that Ethan pulled off the shelf there on O'Reilly Press about address planning. So you're getting sort of the distilled version of that book today, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't go out and buy it, because you should. So the first place to start is really just sort of the overall level of IPv6 adoption that we're seeing. And the reason why this is important, again, my goal has been in really focusing on address planning, sort of greasing the skids for enterprises that are interested in adopting IPv6. And of course, the question is, well, why should they be interested in adopting IPv6? And the answer is because enterprise networks are rapidly becoming islands of the legacy protocol, IPv4, as the rest of the internet adopts IPv6 gradually, for sure, but consistently, yes. So like we look at this particular graph, which is a good place to sort of dive into IPv6 adoption statistics. And this is the traffic that hits Google over IPv6 globally. And I pulled this down on March 9th, and we're seeing native IPv6 traffic somewhere around 27%. So a third of the traffic on the internet essentially is IPv6. Now you can get more granular statistics on a country-by-country basis by going to Akamai, and they publish in their State of the Internet report sort of where IPv6 is at. But you can also see sort of from country to country the levels of IPv6 that they're seeing based on clients that are pulling down content from Akamai. And you can see country by country what those levels are, and you can also see by provider, which is really, when we look at here in the US, this statistic is coming from Akamai, and this is showing us somewhere right below 50% IPv6 adoption. So 50%, close to 50% of the traffic that Akamai is seeing is arriving over IPv6 here in the US.
Is that driven by mobile, Tom, would you say, in the US?
Yeah, great question. So that's the next slide, which is a good inference, rather, I should say, Ethan. And that's exactly it. So what we're really seeing here is just the address space crunch that providers have found themselves in. They need to add more subscribers to the network. They need to be able to do that with a resource that's essentially free, and with IPv4 being entirely exhausted, public IPv4 addresses being entirely exhausted, and of course we all know the painful brittleness of NAT overlays and trying to get a large number of subscribers to connect out to the internet through things like carrier grade NAT, which introduce any number of problems for service providers in the form of things like TCP port exhaustion and lack of geolocation. The inability to do lawful intercept with hundreds or thousands of subscribers abstracted behind one public address. So the providers got the message quite a while ago, and it's kind of hard to see. You can't really see on these graphs, but they're sort of going back to all the way back to the mid 2000s timeframe. But we really start to see the ramp up starting in 2010, 2011, and that's where you see the subscribers really starting to juice their IPv6 deployments. And now, of course, if you look at those statistics, 90, I think it's T-Mobile, Verizon. I think T-Mobile's in the lead here with like maybe somewhere in the order of 90% of their traffic being over IPv6, and of course the remaining 10% is just essentially gear that can't really support IPv6 at this point, old flip phones or that sort of thing, which they're trying to get off their network. And of course, you see the same thing in cable. And here the adoption's a little bit slower because of that equipment problem, that CPE problem, where you've got cable modems out there, DSL modems that maybe aren't necessarily going to support IPv6. And so in any case, you end up with still a huge adoption of IPv6 in both the cable and the mobile service provider space, and that's really why we're seeing those numbers that we're seeing. So really, what you're dealing with then is that you've got service provider networks that have moved full steam ahead with IPv6, and in the meantime, we've got a lot of enterprise networks, and a good, I guess, a good baseline statistic to sort of look at. It's not, it doesn't tell you everything that you could possibly sort of infer about where enterprises are at, but Owen DeLong, who's, I believe he's still with Akamai, a network engineer of some repute, and somebody that's been interested in IPv6 for a long time, he does a test to see what Fortune 500 company websites actually have a Quad A record configured for their primary domain and are actually reachable over IPv6. And there's actually a delta there. The number of Fortune 500 companies that have Quad A for their primary domain is 10%, and the number that actually respond to IPv6 is 9%. So they're putting happy eyeballs through its paces in that case. But so if you use that particular metric, then 10% adoption, if we're being generous and extending that or extrapolating to the remaining enterprises that aren't in the Fortune 500 list, we've got a pretty dismal level of enterprise IPv6 adoption. But hey, if you're thinking about address planning as an enterprise, that's like the thing you should be thinking about initially, because one of the first things that you're going to do as you decide to move forward with IPv6, and that's a call to action for this presentation. If you look at where service providers are at, where the internet is at in general with IPv6, if you're running an enterprise today, hey, you're already running IPv6 internally, you just maybe aren't managing it effectively because you've got all these desktop devices that are actually designed to configure themselves with link local addresses. They have IPv6 enabled by default. You can't really turn it off in the case of Microsoft, or you're out of scope for support. So full steam ahead with IPv6 in the enterprise space, but one of the first boundaries you're going to run into technically is that you have to figure out what to do with the address space that you're going to get. You have to get the address space first of all, and then you have to figure out how you're going to carve it up. And this is where, back in 2008, when I was at Limelight and I got my first 3/32 of IPv6 address space from different regional internet registries, I went partially insane, or more insane than I was before that moment. And part of the reason why was just this issue of having to deal with such a large amount of address space and not really being sure what to do with it. So we'll dive into the part of the presentation where I give you some essential principles for effective IPv6 address planning. And this will hopefully prevent you from going partially insane like I did. If nothing else, a great deal of the anxiety that you're going to have around having a very large amount of space and not really knowing what to do with it. And then also just prevent you from sort of making unforced errors or own goals, as it were, related to getting an IPv6 allocation and starting off down the road that's very familiar to us based on what we've done over the years with IPv4. The first point that can't be made enough, and we've probably all sat through enough presentations on networking and IPv6 to see any number of the analogies that are out there comparing the IPv4 address space to the IPv6 address space. But the point of those is just to sort of try to get the network architect or network engineer to grasp the fact that IPv6 is, for all intents and purposes, an inexhaustible supply of logical addressing for networks. We will just not ever exhaust it before the internet protocol itself really stops being the protocol that we're using. So that's kind of hard to imagine because we're talking about 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And a little analogy, my particular favorite analogy to do the comparison these days is just based on this calculation of the number of stars in the Milky Way. And I'm going to go ahead, and as you can sort of infer from this, I'm going to go ahead and compare the number of stars in the universe to IPv6. So estimates are that there are around 400 billion stars in the Milky Way, somewhere around 2 trillion galaxies in the universe overall. So we do a little bit of multiplication and we come up with this very large number of 8 times 10 to the 23rd for the total number of stars in the universe. And then of course we look at the total number of IPv6 addresses, which with 2 to the 128th, the decimal expansion of that is 3.4 times 10 to the 38th. Do a little division and we come up with this very large number of 4.3 times 10 to the 14th. So what that's basically saying is that there are 430 trillion times more IPv6 addresses than there are estimated stars in the universe.
So we overdid it? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Never say never, or I'm not sure what cliche I want to use there. But
yeah, those IoT people keep cranking out devices. So yeah.
Right. And I was on a podcast earlier today, the IPv6 Buzz podcast, which you guys are gracious enough to host for us, where we geek out on IPv6. And we were interviewing Eric Vink, who was telling us about how there's this new project that he presented on at the IPv6 forum over there in Belgium, which was encoding encoding URIs as IPv6 addresses for video, so that you had the name of the video, the timestamp of the video, the location where it's being broadcast from, obviously, all of that was encoded into the IPv6 address, and so as a URI, so that like 3 seconds of video would be one address URI, and then the next 3 seconds would be another address. And I'm just like, wow, that's really, really cool and kind of crazy. And yeah, is that going to put some, at some point, if something like that ever got widely deployed, would it put some downward pressure on the number of IPv6 addresses? On the number of addresses, yes. On the number of prefixes, no. And that's the critical point that we'll get into here. Because when we're talking about IPv6, we no longer care about host address conservation. And I'll do a quick analogy here that Jeff Doyle, no less a personage in networking than Jeff Doyle himself, was talking about this point that IP will stop being the protocol that we're using on networks a long time before we run out of IPv6 space. And of course, we measure consumption of IPv6 not by host addresses, which would be ridiculous because we've got 1.8 times 10 to the 19th addresses and 1/64, but we measure it by consumption of /48s, which is the smallest routable prefix on the internet. And he did a little calculation to figure out the rate of consumption based on the ramp up of IPv6. Let's extrapolate that out to the year 2100, when, according to population estimates, there could be as many as 15 billion people on the planet. At that point, the current rate of consumption of /48s, there would still be 2,200 /48s available per person for all the 15 billion people on the planet in the year 2100. Out of the current global unicast allocation, which is only 12.5%, that 2000 :/3, which is only 12.5% of the overall 2 to the 128th address space. And of course, if we're talking prefixes, it's really 2 to the 64th that we're eating into. So 25%, or 1/4 of the overall prefixes that are available in the year 2100. And his argument is, if you think we're still going to be using IP in the year 2100, then I've got a bridge to sell you. So
we may still be using spanning tree, though.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We'll be huddled in a cave and figuring out where the root bridge is, right? Huddled in a cave around a fire, figuring out where the root bridge is. So here, let's talk about the early enterprise IPv6 adopter. And this, of course, could work for service provider as well. This is a guy who's pulled up to his local drive-through window, Bob's ISP or Aaron or Ripe or whoever he's getting it from. And he's like, I really beat the rush here. I got started with IPv6 early. I'm an early technology adopter, not a laggard like these other enterprises. And I'm really gonna do everything right and get started with IPv6 early. And so the problem is, this guy doesn't have any of these principles that we're going to learn today about how to put together a proper IPv6 address plan and what he should be thinking about. He's still thinking in terms of the IPv4 network that he's been running. And so he gets a /48. And then on the surface, we think, well, hey, that's great. That's 281 trillion internets that are contained in terms of host addresses inside of a single /48. So he's pretty happy. But of course, talk about the UNIX philosophy, basically giving yourself enough rope, giving you enough rope to hang yourself with, and then a couple of feet more just to be sure. If you're used to making do, and this is where we get into the IPv4 thinking that our early enterprise adopter is sort of saddled with, and that's that a 10/8 is what, you know, what he's used to working with, or what he or she is used to working with. And we'll call that 1 meter of rope. Well, a /48 gives you enough rope to get to the moon a billion times. So clearly, we're not dealing with the same order of magnitude, several orders of magnitude related to the IP address space that's available in terms of host addresses versus the number of host addresses that are available in IPv6. So a /48, as we say, 281 trillion internets. It's more than enough address space for any enterprise, but then of course, so is a /64, which goes on a single interface. That's 4.3 billion internets. /80. Now I'm breaking the law here because I'm subnetting beyond the /64, which we don't do. But the point is just that we've got this ridiculous amount of host addressing that we're just not going to use. So a /96 would be an entire internet just for your enterprise if we were subnetting to the right of the /64, which we're not doing. But this is the point. This is the IPv4 thinking that many enterprise network architects, when they get started with IPv6 and they're doing their first address plan, the whole idea is that we don't want to waste host addresses. And we have to identify this IPv4 thinking as a significant risk to an effective IPv6 address plan. Because what we're going to start wanting to do is take our allocation, which in the case of our example is a /48, and as we'll see in a moment, that's actually much too small of an allocation. Even though it's a ridiculous amount of IPv6 host address space. But we've got to recognize that we're going to fall back into our IPv4 thinking ways where we take a block and we start carving it up to try to conserve host addresses. We don't care about host address conservation in IPv6. We're so used to using variable length subnet masking in IPv4 that we get into making sure that we're carving up prefixes in order to conserve the amount of host addresses that we want to use, and we use that as a sort of measurement of efficiency in terms of address consumption. But in IPv6, we do subnetting on nibble boundaries. We do it at 4 bits at a time, so we don't really care about those single bit subnets. And that doesn't mean you can't subnet on bits in IPv6. Of course, you can subnet along just individual bit boundaries if you care to, but initially we'd like to try to keep things tidy by staying at that 4-bit boundary. And there's a reason that actually makes our operations easier to do, which we'll look at in a moment here later in the presentation. And then the final point here is that since we're in this conservation crouch related to IPv4 being exhausted, we've never gotten really that much public space to begin with as an enterprise. And if we're a larger enterprise, we may have multiple blocks of overlapping private address space that we're used to carving up. We really get into this mindset where we're just trying to make do with the prefix that we have, and we're not used to the idea that we actually can just go get more address space if we need it.
So one question that's come in here, Tom. I'll read it. It's from Justin. He says, I can get behind the idea that a large amount of IPv6 space is available, but I still can't help thinking that we are being wasteful if we use a /64 where we only need maybe 2 addresses. Isn't that the kind of short-term thinking that caused us to run out of IPv4 space in the first place?
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And we'll look at a very specific example of that in a moment. The point that I would make in response to that is that you can take it up with the management, as it were. When the IETF was coming up with a new protocol in the early 90s to replace IPv4, and they picked on the 128-bit address space, and they basically took half of that and said that's going to be the interface identifier. So 2 to the 64th, and that's going to characterize the addresses that are on a single interface, on a single link. So it's really baked into the protocol. But again, just based on the example that I gave earlier, and again, I sympathize with the question because I went through this over and over and over again, initially at Limelight, where it's like, okay, I've got these point-to-point links, and I'm going to go ahead and allocate an entire /64 and use 2 addresses out of an entire /64 to number that point-to-point link, and that just seems absurd. But of course, this is how the protocol is designed. 2 to the 64 is the interface identifier, and if you think about it in terms of just being an arithmetic problem, does it really make a difference whether I can configure 2 addresses or 100 addresses or 10,000 addresses? You know, what's the limit I can put on a single link based on layer 2 to layer 3 mapping? You know, maybe it's, I don't know, like 64K. What's the practical limit? If I'm in a data center environment where I'm spinning up a lot of virtual servers and that sort of thing, I don't know. Like, at what point do switches start to fall over based on you know, getting past that? Whatever that number is, let's just say for the sake of argument, let's make it 10 million. I mean, we could make it 1 billion. It doesn't matter. If you divide 10,000 or 1 billion or 10 billion by 1.8 times 10 to the 19th, you're still dealing with a tiny fraction of the overall space. So to assuage that anxiety and that paranoia about wasting addresses, just remind yourself that it's baked into the standards. It's baked into the protocol. 2 to the 64th is the space that's reserved for the interface identifier, and it's supposed to go on a single link. And if you know, then moving past that point, just go back to the example from Jeff Doyle, which is that even at the current rate of consumption of /48s, and even as that ramps up to move the whole internet to IPv6, you know, in 2100, we still have 2200 /48s for 15 billion people, and that's out of the only 25% of the existing 2 to the 64th prefix space that we have in IPv6 addressing. So even if we totally mucked it up, we just allocate another /3, another quarter of the available prefix space, and we could start over and you know, atone for our errors the first time around. So what you don't want to do, the first thing that you really don't want to do is try in any way, shape, or form to take what you're doing in IPv4 today and map it in any way to IPv6. This is just absolutely a disaster if you attempt to do this. It's a greenfield opportunity to build an address plan that will scale indefinitely. To the point where, you know, you'll hand the network off to your the folks that are coming in, the next generation, and the address plan will still be good to go, because you haven't done something crazy like attempted to take your existing IPv4 address plan and map your v6 address plan into it. But let's get into this question of interface assignment. So this is a sort of a deeper dive into the whole IPv4 thinking problem. If we talk about IPv4 interface assignment, you know, if you're lucky and you've got a lot of /24s, you've got a big enough prefix lying around in IPv4, whether it's private space or public space, maybe you can afford to just throw a /24 at an interface and be done. And that's great if you can. Harkening back to the early days of the internet when we had classful addressing, and the whole reason for that was to try to make things efficient in terms of assignment. Of course, we just didn't have enough bits to actually make that work. We do have enough bits as it happens in IPv6, or enough nibbles rather. But back to this example, a /24, we throw it at an interface. Let's say we're aiming to keep things under 75% utilization. So, you know, we've got a tidy boundary for ACLs and routing summarization if we need to do that, and we've got some room for growth on the segment. But of course, that's in a perfect world. More realistically, we're trying to conserve IPv4 address space in terms of host addresses. And so let's say we've only got 8 hosts on that segment. So maybe we go ahead and configure a /28 using variable length subnet masking to give us 14 host addresses. And there's some advantages to that. It's 57% utilization, so we can grow it. We can actually add some hosts onto that, or some servers onto that segment. Another approach we could take, let's say if there's a larger number of hosts, we could try a couple of different size subnets. /27 gives us 100% utilization if we've got 30 hosts. Of course, we can't grow, we can't actually add any servers or hosts onto that segment without doing some renumbering. So maybe we go with a larger subnet. We peel off one more bit, and now we've got 48% utilization, and we've got some room for growth. Let's say we've got 119 hosts, we can go through the same exercise, but you can see the point here. I'm using variable length subnet masking to do what I do in IPv4, which is to conserve host addresses. Well, in IPv6, I just don't care. Everything gets a /64. Anything less than 1.8 times 10 to the 19th, it's going to get a /64. So that's getting back to Justin's
Is there also a benefit in this /64, not just because we don't care, but is there efficiency we gain in router memory, router route table allocations, and so on? This came up in our Slack
Yeah,
channel.
that's right. It came up on the Ask Me Anything, right? And when I saw that, it's like, yeah, absolutely. So that's really that question about fib space and TCAM profiles. I mean, that's really a service provider question. And if you're a service provider and you're sort of running into that problem, well, kind of shame on you for not having gear that has a TCAM profile that you can modify, but also, as you point out, right? So we're really trying to get back to, it's not really classful addressing per se, but it's this idea that we have these larger prefixes, these standard prefix sizes that summarize pretty neatly. And of course, that should help drive down route disaggregation, the number of prefixes that we see in that we have to account for in TCAM. So we should be gaining some efficiency here on the routing side of things. And of course, this is incredibly valuable on the security side of things for ACLs, where, we can all, like I can remember back in the day, like all the ways of like peeling off like a single bit in a subnet mask in order to do some crazy things with selecting, a range of addresses that I wanted to apply a particular policy to. You can't do that in IPv6 because you don't have a subnet mask, first of all, but you don't want to do that because you basically, if you have a particular class of traffic, if you have a particular application or a particular network that needs a policy, then you just peel off a larger subnet and you throw it at that, that part of the network or that set of applications, and you use that that nibble boundary efficiency to really simplify your security policy and potentially routing summarization if you're having to do that. So that's really what we're talking about with IPv6 is this simplification of what goes on interfaces. And so with interface assignment, the only time we'll see something other than a /64 is if you have a loopback interface where you have the equivalent of a /32 in IPv4, you have a /128. And then occasionally you'll see on some legacy hardware, there was a problem where you could exhaust the neighbor discovery cache by doing some sort of attack. And so you would want to configure a 127 for a point-to-point link, but you would still allocate an entire /64 for that point-to-point link.
So, okay, so you just addressed a question that had come in about security. They reference a ping pong attack where the traffic is sent to an IP address within the 64, but it's not one of the two IPs on either side of the link. So is that something that's been addressed in v6 itself, or is this what you were just saying, where you actually use a /127 to avoid that situation, even though you've allocated a /64 from a planning perspective?
Yeah, my understanding is that that's a legacy hardware problem. If you have to check with the routing platform you're using. It's something that came up in like the mid to late 2000s, and that most of the interfaces that were impacted by that, if you've kept up with Tech Refresh, you should be able to configure a /64 and not be vulnerable to that attack. But you should check with your vendor. But yeah, you would actually configure a /127 on the link and then reserve the 64 that it came out of. That entire 64 gets assigned to that link. So it's not a scenario like we do in v4 where we have a /24 and we're pulling /30s out of it.
Yes, got it. I'm glad you clarified that. Exactly that. Yeah.
So what we're doing then is overcoming the limits of IPv4 address planning with IPv6, where we never have enough addresses or prefixes in v4. Bits available in v4, an address can't scale to facilitate mapping any or all hierarchy into the network structure and into the address plan. And there's some operational benefits to doing that. Of course, we don't want to go overboard, but it's back in the day when you took an octet in IPv4 and like the 10 space, and you're like, well, I'll make the second octet the region. It's like, well, then I've only got 16 bits left to play with, and of course 8 of those bits are reserved for the host addresses, and so I just run out of bits and I can't do that sort of thing. In v6 I don't have a similar problem. But before we get into that, let's talk about the 3 most important IPv6 subnet sizes. So I've talked a little bit about the standardization of sort of subnets in IPv6 that sort of harkens back to classful addressing, even though it's not actually that. But the organizational allocation, which is the large allocation that you're going to get from the regional internet registry or from your ISP, site assignment, which is the prefix that goes on a site, and then of course interface subnets, which we've already talked about, which is a /64 unless it's a /128. So an effective IPv6 address plan requires a sufficiently large IPv6 allocation. Well, how big should your organizational allocation be? Here's a small graph to show you. Most enterprises are going to receive a /32 to a /44. So here we're dealing with nibbles. So we get a /32. Before we dive into the math behind this or the arithmetic behind it, a /48 is assigned per site within the organization. So you want to think about things in terms of the number of /48s that you get. A /32 will give you 65,000 of them. A /36, moving to the next nibble, the next 4 bits, will give you 4,096 /48s. A /40 will give you 256, and a /44 will give you 16. So the idea is then you just figure out how many sites you have in your organization, and it's going to fall into one of those buckets. And it's not very granular, obviously. It's like, well, maybe I have more than 16 sites, but certainly not more than 256. So that would be somewhere between a /44 and a /40. But you can see from our example of the early enterprise adopter who got a /48 and was super happy, he already screwed up, because that's only going to work if his particular enterprise is one site. And so there's some question here as to, like, are you talking about multi-homing? Is it when we talk about multiple sites, do they all have to have an independent connection to the internet to classify as a site? No, it's basically a logical definition, an operational definition that makes sense for your network. And that's really what characterizes a site in IPv6. So is the regional internet registry going to police your particular definition of a site? And the answer is no. It's a logical construct. You can define sites in your address plan in a way that makes operational sense for your network. You don't have to use a /48. You can use a larger allocation per site. You could use, like, if you had large data centers, you could use a /44 if you wanted to, if it made sense. If you don't have enough /48s or whatever you assign to a site, rather than carving up the space in a more granular fashion, rather than moving away from the nibble boundary and starting to do individual bit prefixes, you just go back to the regional internet registry or the ISP, but that's not as likely. Regional internet registry, you get more IPv6 address space because they've held IPv6 address space, contiguous space in reserve based on your initial request. So here are some site assignment examples. Corporate headquarter campus could be a site that would get a /48, a data center, a regional office, a home network, a laptop at the end of a Hurricane Electric 6-4 tunnel can actually get a /48 allocated to it. The home network, we just recently talked to Dan Torbett of Cable Labs, where they came up, they helped refine the DOCSIS 3 specification. He said in general, most of the mobile broadband networks are assigning a /56 these days. But going forward, we may see a larger allocation for HomeNet as HomeNets get a little more sophisticated. What was I going to say about that? Yeah.
On provider independent space, if I go to my rear, I'm going to need to justify basically the number of /48s I'm looking for. Is that what they're going to look for?
Yeah, you can, and they'll provide guidance. If you come to them with an operational plan and you're carving up the network based on your operational plan and how you're sort of conceiving of how the network is laid out and how you want to address it, they'll work with you based on the plan that you provide. A good rule of thumb is using a /48 per site, and then basically however you're defining a site and however you're defining what you think your level of utilization will be on the number of sites that you plan on adding to the network, it'll be fine. The regional internet registry will work with you based on what you decide is going to give you the most operational efficiency. And if you think, well, down the road I may decide that I'm going to have a lot of IoT networks that are going to be coming online, and each of those is going to get its own /48. That's perfectly acceptable to do. I've got, maybe I'll add, let's say, just make it an upper bound of 100 IoT networks over the next 5 years, and maybe that's being like wildly optimistic, but whatever. This is your pie in the sky plan for your address plan, so that you don't have to redo it. If I add another 100 /48s to my original request, and that bumps me up from 16 /48s to more than 256, then I go from requesting a /40 to a /44 to a /40, or up to a /36. For larger enterprises these days, I just say, hey, ask for a /32. Put your plan together to lay out your network in a way that shows, your number of /48s that you're consuming per site, and then, sort of back into the number to show that you're going to be carving up that space in a way that justifies that /32. Again, you're not going to get a lot of pushback from the regional internet registries on this. They want you to get the space that you need. They've already allocated an additional nibble, a contiguous nibble in reserve for you to number into down the road should you decide you need it. And they really want you to deploy IPv6. So, and here's the last example of a /48. So apparently we learned that German fire trucks using mobile IPv6 are actually configured with /48. And that's an accurate picture of a German fire truck, as far as I can tell from a Google search.
So Tom, one question on efficiencies come up here. I think this is actually an important design point to raise. The question is, with a /64 being so large, is there a concern about network discovery protocol storms, or kind of like you might have an IPv4 broadcast storm? And I think just because you've got a /64, you're still going to be careful about the number of hosts you put in that segment, right?
That's right. Yeah, all of the same rules apply, and there aren't any built-in risks or impediments. I mean, the reverse is true in that it's virtually impossible to, or it is impossible rather, to do just a brute force scan of a /64. You can do the solicited node multicast address hack search, and that narrows it down to a smaller subset of that address space. But in terms of how, I just haven't run into scenarios where there's been a lot of concern about the way in which that /64 is handling, the particular piece of gear is handling the mapping between layer 2 and layer 3. The larger concerns in that domain are making sure that whatever policies you're practicing on a link today related to first hop security, that that you have gear in place that can do the same thing in IPv6 to do things like DHCP inspection to make sure that you don't have a rogue DHCP v6 server on the segment, for instance, that sort of thing. First hop security for IPv6. So usually what happens then with enterprise, if they're an early adopter, they just didn't get a large enough allocation based on this idea of a /64 per interface, a /48 per site, and the fact that we're going to want to use nibble boundaries. And so they don't really have a lot of experience interacting with rears, or if they do, they're used to being told no because they just don't have the v4 space to hand out anymore. But very much the opposite is true with IPv6. You can easily go back to the rear, as I mentioned, and get more address space if your address plan requires it. So the type of allocation you should receive, provider assigned, is something you would get from an ISP, and it's best for single home networks. That's where if I move to a different ISP, I would actually have to number out of that space. In that case, I would probably want to use something like NPTv6 so that I wouldn't, I'd use ULA on my end and I wouldn't have to renumber, and I'd just do a one-to-one mapping of the /48, the public /48 to a ULA block internally. That's not really a good design, in my opinion. Moving into this new environment with IPv6, everybody should really be aspiring to get a provider independent allocation just to avoid renumbering issues down the road. And that looks like this. So I've used the documentation range for this, but you have to use your imagination, and those would be blocks coming out of that 2000 /3 global unicast allocation.
And for people that are thinking, I'll use EULA address space and NAT to avoid the renumbering thing, I guess I'm referring to one of your podcasts that I listened to recently here,
yes.
But that's also a non-starter.
Yeah, it's really it's a solution in search of a problem. I mean, I just can't think of a scenario where, unless you had some sort of weird regulatory requirements where you just couldn't use global unicast addressing internally because you had some sort of strange regulatory or compliance requirements. You're really missing out on the benefit of getting NAT out of the way. And trying to force a configuration that you've relied on in IPv4, trying to force the same thing in IPv6. If you were stuck with a single ISP and you had to get a block and you thought you might renumber down the road at some point by moving to a new ISP, then maybe you'd want to use NPTv6. But that's different than NAT, right? Because it's stateless. And you just do a one-to-one translation between whatever the address is and the GUA address to whatever the equivalent address is in ULA. In any case, with subnetting done on nibble boundaries, that's really where we should be at. We talked about these very sort of ungranular buckets, 65K, 4K, 256, and 16. So we just start thinking about carving up the network along those boundaries, and we just have a group of things, whatever that might be, a group of network segments, a group of data centers, whatever the entity is that you want to address. Think of it in terms of which of these buckets it sort of falls into, and then you're going to carve up the prefix based on that. And the reason why we stick to the nibble boundary is that we can actually make the prefix more legible by doing that. As soon as we move to a bit boundary, then we've got this, we've got to actually look deeper into the prefix to see where that boundary is in the range. And if we stick to the nibble boundary, then we can actually map function or location information into the prefix and it stays consistent. So like I could make a particular group of /52s, 16/52s coming out of my /48, I could actually encode that into that character within the IPv6 prefix. And so then going forward, I would always know exactly which site I was dealing with. That can be beneficial. That can actually assist in operations if, obviously we've got DNS for that sort of thing as well. But as we know, in the thick of things, when we've got an outage and we're trying to troubleshoot things, a layer 1 knock or layer 2 knock, the less information they have to sort of look up. If they know where a particular prefix lives, they can drill down on the problem much more quickly. So maybe I want to reserve that particular character in the prefix for, say, building location. I can do anything with that. It doesn't have to be buildings. It could be whatever entity makes the most sense operationally for me. And of course, I can do the same thing with interface subnets. And I've got some decisions to make within a /48 of how I want to carve up that space. 65/48 to /64, I've got, with a /48, I've got 65,000 /64s. And of course, I could start to carve those up in a hierarchical way if the particular site that I was numbering required that, and I needed to do some summarization or some ACL boundaries or whatever. But the point is that I just stick to the nibble boundary in order to make things eminently more readable. Okay, so that's, I think we're pretty much out of time. So definitely check out this case study that's in the slides that you can grab. This is just sort of back of the napkin, what it would look like if you were carving up an allocation for a large enterprise. So I'll leave that as an exercise for the reader, and I'd be happy to answer additional questions you might have if you want to hit me up on Twitter at IPv6Tom. Then more information obviously is available in my IPv6 address planning tome. It's actually not that much of a tome. It's pretty concise.